Imagine walking down the street in your home city with a dear friend of yours. The city is impoverished and run down. There might be reasons to hate it, but it is at last home. A home you feel safe in, or well, used to feel safe in. This was the story of Barbara Kentner, a 34-year-old Indigenous woman who was walking down the street when a passing car threw a hitch at her, causing her to tragically pass away. This occurred in Thunder Bay, the Indigenous murder capital of Canada, a city home to countless incidents of similar nature, a city that acts as a live embodiment of the injustices faced by Indigenous women at the hands of our system. The murder rate for Indigenous women in Canada is 6 times higher than the average. In the past decade alone, 500 Indigenous women have been killed due to violence originating from their own communities, and over 4,000 women have disappeared without a trace. This crisis has been going on for decades without an end in sight. The plight of Indigenous women has been ignored, almost as if they're second-class citizens. Whilst most of these murders are committed by other Indigenous folk who know the women, a significant 14% are committed by bigoted strangers. It's clear, may it be toxic environments at home or in public, Canada has failed to provide its Indigenous women with safe livelihoods. Why is this? It's because there are deep-rooted issues within the Canadian policing system. According to Al Jazeera, an Indigenous person is 10 times more likely to be shot and killed by the police compared to their white counterparts. The narratives of apathy towards Indigenous victims and the unjust treatment of suspects reflect a troubling and evident pattern. The Indigenous people's word is not valued the same as other races. An example was when an Indigenous family called the police begging to find a missing family member, but the police failed to intervene. They ignored it, leading to the family member freezing to death. Instances like these underscore the reality that the Indigenous community faces. They live in a place where they can't trust those who are supposed to serve and protect. According to the Assembly of First Nations, an Indigenous person is twice as likely to mistrust their local police compared to other Canadians. To combat this, the government has implemented a National Action Plan. The National Action Plan is a strategic framework for addressing gender-based violence. It includes 5 pillars: support for victims, survivors, and their families, prevention, a responsive justice system, implementing Indigenous-led approaches, and a social infrastructure that enables an environment. While this is a step in the correct direction, it is a reactive measure. The need for this plan speaks volumes about the initial inadequacies and dismissive attitude that has brought us here.
Why do these situations come up time and time again? Ever since the Indian Act of 1876, the quicksand of poverty has been engulfing Indigenous people, drowning them in intergenerational trauma, stripping their lands and livelihoods away from them, suffocating them in ways that still impact them to this day. The same process led to the displacement of Indigenous peoples from their traditional territories and confined them to small and remote reserves, characterized by limited economic opportunities, inadequate housing, and low education access. Further compounding this is the fact that these systemic barriers can increase the likelihood of involvement in criminal activities and, in general, interactions with law enforcement. Additionally, Indigenous peoples have experienced systemic racism and discrimination within the criminal justice system, including racial profiling, biases in sentencing, and unequal access to legal representation. This has resulted in more Indigenous people being arrested, charged, and entering the criminal justice system, burying them in the quicksand of our making.
As we reflect on the challenges faced by the Indigenous communities, there's a glimmer of hope for a better future. Recent actions, including special safety funding aimed at safeguarding Indigenous interests, signify a step towards addressing long-standing disparities. This investment, coupled with a shifting societal attitude, offers promise for positive change. Canadians have increasingly become receptive to the plight of the Indigenous peoples, thanks in part to changes in educational curricula that foster understanding and empathy. In 2021, the government announced significant funding allocations totaling $126.7 million over 3 years, demonstrating a commitment to improving Indigenous well-being. These funds were designated for culturally safe services, essential changes to the healthcare systems, and initiatives aimed at combating anti-Indigenous racism. Together, these efforts offer hope for a future where Indigenous communities can thrive with dignity, respect, and equality. In the end, it remains to be seen if the walk down the street can ever be safe for Indigenous people in a home that's not safe.